Hey, welcome back to Gold Scratch. Some of the best ideas that I get for helpful, formative videos come from viewers, and this is exactly what that is. I had a loyal viewer recently email me. Name was Eric, and he's rebuilding his Buick GS engine, first rebuild, and he had a list of tools that he already had acquired or knew he needed to acquire, and asked me, "Is there anything missing here?" So I thought, you know what? That's a pretty good question. And there's probably lots, if you're watching this channel, you're probably interested in engine building or partial engine, being involved in doing that. So we decided to make a video about all the tools that you need to build an engine. And that's what this video is about. I got them all, a whole bunch of them laid out here. We're going to talk about some of them for you and describe them. What you need to prepare yourself if you decide you want to build, even one engine, you still need tools. There's more than one way to do everything. Some tools you can rent, okay? You don't need to buy them if you're just doing one engine, or borrow them or something like that. If you're going to build a lot of engines, then you probably got to get yourself set up with all the tools that you're going to need. So before I go any further, while I got you here still, please like and subscribe, share this video with somebody, get yourself on the list for notifications, etc. YouTube looks at all that and says, hey, somebody likes this video. Let's show it to somebody else. And that's how we survive, basically, in YouTube land. So please help me out with that. So what we're going to do is go through, and I'm going to pick up and show you or display a whole bunch of tools, what they're used for, why you need them, etc. And once again, you don't necessarily need everything that I have here. There's more than one way of doing almost everything. And in some cases, you can get by in various ways. But this is how I do it, and I'm going to share that with you. So there's some things that aren't in view of the camera. Here's a whole bunch of stuff here on the top shelf, bottom shelf that I'm going to go through. There's some things that aren't, like a torch is pretty handy. If you're taking apart an old crusty engine that's all rusted up, pretty good chance you're going to need a torch to do that. A bench grinder is also probably one of my most valuable tools. Cleaning up parts. If you're restoring engines, unless you're buying everything brand new, you're going to have rust on stuff. A bench grinder with a wire wheel on it is a very valuable tool. It's not in view of the camera right now. A way to clean parts. So I've got a parts cleaning tank with, probably 20 gallons of aerosol in it for cleaning up parts. And a way to, while we're at it, a way to clean your hands after. I got the luxury of a sink in my shop, which is really nice, because my wife won't let me in the house with dirty hands. So I've got no choice. That's why I put a sink in the house, in the shop. So not everybody has that, but you need a way to do that. So you got to think about that in advance. So another thing to remember is you need a way to pick the engine up. So this is how I solved that, because I got limited space. When I designed this garage, I knew I had limited space. And I actually had a shop like this in one of my previous lives. I had a beam in it. It was really useful. So I put a beam in this shop, put this beam in all by myself. Believe it or not, it's 26 feet wide, I think, something like that. So it's a really handy way to pick up an engine. And then you need an engine stand. I've got 3 of them, and they're all, the only one's not busy right now, but it's going to be pretty soon. A way to hold on to your engine to work on it. Now, I just said there's more than one way of doing it, everything. So my very first engine stand I made out of 4x4 timbers. And bolted them together. You couldn't rotate it. You had to rotate it by hand. I've seen guys build engines on a steel bench. I built that first engine in '69 down in my mother's basement. Pretty heavy getting up the stairs, so I had to bolt 2 angle irons to it, and we carried it up like a coffin, you would carry a casket in the funeral. Basically, 4 guys carried it up. So that's not, I'm not suggesting you do that, but that's how I did that one. So, but you need an engine stand or some way to hold and manipulate your engine so you can get at it, and a way to lift it. So got that stuff out of the way. There's probably a few things that I did forget. Nice to have a startup stand, yes. I I don't know, 40 or 50 engines in the last 5 or 6 years. So obviously this gets lots of use. Every engine's been on that stand. It's a nice thing to have. I've made videos before how to build one. I think I got about $2,000 invested in that. You can buy a kit, or a lot of guys fabricate them themselves. And then you got to buy things like a fan, and you got to buy switches, and you got to buy a fuel pump, and you need headers and all that kind of stuff. So it's you know, it grows. But for me, that's the first thing I did when I was getting back into building engines, is build a stand, because then I know when it goes out of here, it starts and runs and doesn't have leaks and all that stuff. I can do diagnostic checks. And the next step after the stand, of course, is dyno Daryl's dyno. That's the ultimate engine tool. Not everybody has access. I'm lucky that I do. And we dyno every engine for reasons that I mentioned. So let's start here, and I hope I don't miss anything. I'll get this out of the way. I don't build LS engines. I actually did plan to. I had one from a customer that was used in drag racing that was boosted. And this is some of the, I bought a whole bunch of special LS tools, the torque to turn, etc. And he never ended up going through with the rebuild. And I made a decision after that. I got enough to do with my old school engines, and I'm not really into it. So actually I should sell this stuff off someday. So I'm going to start at this end of the, just so I don't lose track. And this is not necessarily in the order that you need them. And you don't necessarily need one either, but these are the tools that I use. So if you're going to CC your heads, if you want to calculate compression, you need to know your combustion chamber volume. So the burette is the way to do that. And I have one, of course, and I use it quite a bit. If you're going to build heads, you need valve spring, a way to check your valve spring forces, and that's what this is. This is not really a tool I'm very happy with, the way it's made, but it works, and I managed to work with it. It's still expensive, but the other style is even more expensive. But anyway, it does the job, and so I'm continuing to use it. You need a little oil can, right? Of course you do. So starting at the back, you need a way to get the harmonic balancer off. So this is the harmonic balancer puller. There's 3 long bolts go in there to connect your balancer and pull the balancer off. There's only one way to get it off. So you need that. This is a puller to take the gear off. Remove this gear from the top of from the front of the crankshaft. And that's the tool for doing that. You need a puller for that. Then when you go to put the balancer back on, you need a balancer install tool. So this is, some guys hammer them on it. Oh, I got this in my hand to remind me. You need air compressor, and you probably can get by without it. But if you're going to do things, I mean, I can't live without one. You need an air compressor of some kind. So, of course, I have one here. So this is an install tool. This threads into this where the bolt goes. This ends for big blocks. This ends for small blocks. And whatever engine, this is a 7/16. This is 1/2 inch. And the little bearing allows you to push your balancer on without hammering on it. So a good thing to do. Once again, not in the order that you need them, in the order that I'm finding them. A vacuum gauge. When you start an engine up for diagnostics, you need to be able to measure the engine vacuum. And so once again, you don't have to have one, but I have one and I use it lots. A dial indicator, a magnetic-based dial indicator is essential. It's used for lots of things. Degreeing the camshaft, finding top dead center, measuring the thrust, measuring a whole bunch of things, measuring your camshaft lift, etc. Probably one of the most used tools in the shop. This is a bridge that goes over top of your block. It's magnetic, and it sits on the top of the block, and the dial indicator there goes in here, and it's a way of measuring top dead center. It's a way of measuring if you're degreeing a camshaft. That's one way to do that, is to use this bridge. So that's a nice little tool. These are not, of course, very expensive. So I got to thank my friend Brian Hambley for this one, because I was putting my micrometers in my vise, and there's a thing called micrometer vise. So now I have a micrometer vise, and that's a pretty handy tool. This is one of the most valuable tools in my box, a magnet. They're not expensive. And I fished lots of little things out of small spaces with this that I never would have got out if I didn't have a magnet. They're also handy if you're changing valve springs on an engine. You use that magnet to catch the keepers, and it holds onto the keepers for you until you're ready to put them back on. So valuable, valuable tool. So I'm going to stop here and go to the top level and then come back. So once again, not in the order that you need them. Adjustable push rods. So when you make any changes to an engine, different camshaft, different cylinder heads, etc., most of the time the push rods that are stock are not going to be the right length anymore. And if you put a roller cam in, for sure they're going to be like an inch shorter or more. So adjustable push rods is where you put that push rod in, adjust it until we know what length we need, and take it back out. And when we do, I might as well jump over here, and then we have to measure it. So if you want to measure anything more than this little guy, vernier caliper is a really, really handy tool. This one only goes up to 6 inches. But if you want to measure a push rod, this is the only way to do that. So it's a fairly expensive tool, and it doesn't get a lot of use, but when you need it, and that's why I have one. So going down the line, so this little bird's beak deal only works on small block Chevs. If you're trying to determine the right push rod length, once again, okay, is you push that on the rocker arm stud, and this side goes on where the push rod is, this side goes where the valve is, or the other way around, I can't remember now. Yeah, the other way around. No, this is the push rod. So if the gap is too much here, then your push rod is too short. If the gap is too much here, then your push rod is too long. It's a pretty nice tool. It's not expensive. It's a fast way to measure, and it works most of the time on small blocks. You have to check that out, but it's a nice handy tool. Unfortunately, it only works on small block Chevs. So when we're turning the crankshaft of an engine and we don't have the balancer on it, we don't have the balancer bolt, this has got a keyway in it, 1/2 inch socket on the backside, slides onto the crankshaft. Like, oh, that's a big block. Sorry, that's a 409. This is for a small block Chev, by the way, so it fits on a small block Chev. And there's a keyway in it, so that's how we're able to turn an engine crankshaft. If you can't do that, this is just a balancer bolt, but you can buy balancer bolts that are longer. The stock bolt, the standard bolt, if you're trying to turn an engine to lots, your ratchet is going to slip off. It's not handy. But if you can buy special ones that are longer, and that way you don't have to worry about that. It won't fall off on you. This is a positive stop tool. If you're trying to find top dead center in an engine that's assembled with the heads on, so that this part screws in like the spark plug does, and this part goes in and out. It's kind of jammed right there. You go. Goes in and out far enough. And the piston comes up. It hits the piston. You just do it gently, not with the starter by hand. You do that gently. You find where it stops there. Then you rotate it the other way. Halfway in between is top dead center. So that's a top dead center tool. If we're trying to torque something on an engine and it's turning over, let's say the flywheel bolts, for example, you're trying to torque the flywheel bolts, what happens? 60 or 70 foot-pounds of torque, the engine starts turning over. This bolts to the flange of your bell housing. These teeth engage with the flywheel, and it prevents it from turning temporarily while you're doing that. So that's handy. These are the guys that are checking springs. So one way when you're checking camshafts or valve lift or whatever, take out the big heavy springs because you don't want to be forcing against the big heavy springs, and you install checking springs. Make sure you take them back out before you go ahead and put the right springs back in. So just as they come up, spark plug tool. There's other ways of doing that, but this is one for gapping spark plugs. Electrically, you need a way to check, and there's a couple of ways. I think I just got, that's a simple way. The light goes on or it doesn't go on. Just to show you, if if you're looking, let's say one of the things I do before every startup, I go to the little wire that gives me my 12 volts to the coil and make sure it works. So I use this and measures the voltage and make sure I know what voltage. But for any other kind of troubleshooting electrically, it's also an ohm meter, a voltage meter, and an amperage meter as well. So that's a handy thing. Going by here, but the other thing you need is a notebook. You got to keep notes on what you do. Don't rely on your memory. Like me anyway, don't rely on your memory. You got to write it down. Write down everything that I do. And then I go in the house on my computer and I transfer that to an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document or something like that. And it's a permanent record that stays on my computer. But you need a way to make notes. I go through one of these every couple of months, and this one's full now. So you need a calculator. You're going to be calculating stuff, and you need a calculator to do that. So also snap gauge. These are handy, inexpensive tools. So I've got a whole set of snap gauges here, every size that you probably need. And one of the handiest, one of the best ways or best uses for a snap gauge, what it is called a snap gauge is because when you tighten down the handle here, you put it into any space that you want, and then it expands to the space that it is. And then you get your caliper out after you do that, wherever it is, and you can measure. If you're trying to measure, for example, one of the best uses for it is measure installed height of your valve springs. And that's how I measure most of the time, my installed height of valve springs. There's other ways to do that. Here's the other way right here. The problem with these guys is they're cumbersome if you put it on and off. This is a valve spring checker. So it actually goes in place to your valve spring and you adjust it until you take up all the clearance. And you measure the height, and that's how what your installed height of your valve spring is. They're accurate, but if you're doing 16 valve springs, you're going to find it's a nuisance to do that. I actually find that this is just as handy. You can only buy, the shims come 15, 30, and 60 thousandths anyways, so you don't have to worry about measuring to 1 thousandths because, once again, you can't get shims to 1 thousandths. So this is accurate enough. Gram scale. So if you want to measure the weight of your pistons or any other thing that you're worried about, the weight or balancing or whatever, you need a gram scale. This guy is, I think this is actually made for checking the temperature of the roast in your oven. But on a startup, I can scan every header just outside of the exhaust manifold or header and of every cylinder, or even on the dyno. We use this frequently just to make sure every cylinder is firing. So typically, normal engine when it's idling might be 500 or 600 degrees. So if you got one at 100 degrees, you know that cylinder is not firing, right, pulling its weight. So you need to do something about that. So that's a good way to detect a miss. And if you got a miss in your engine, by the way, you don't know what cylinder it is, you might find that handy. A little light for getting down into small spaces if you have to. So I think I've covered the top level. Let's go back to here. In the previous video, I actually, with the 409, I actually demonstrated using a dial bore gauge, and it's back in its home again, but using a dial bore gauge. I just made a video about this to measure the clearance. Actually, I measured piston clearance. And so I've already made the speech on the dial bore gauge. It is, for me, probably one of the most important tools. If you want to be precise and accurate in assembly, you use a dial bore gauge and you use micrometers, and you take those measurements, you put them on there, and you go in the house, you put them on your computer. And the other thing you need if you're using a dial bore gauge is a set of micrometers. So I've got to open the box up for you. So I got a full set, of course, of micrometers. The one that gets used the most, if you just want to buy two, for most engines, a 2 to 3 will cover your crankshaft, and a 4 to 5 for most engines, or maybe a 3 to 4, depending on your engine, are the ones you're going to use the most. So those are two if you want to be accurate. Once again, not everybody needs to do things the way I do, but I'm just describing how I do it. So A leak down tester. This is my Moroso leak down tester. This is an old friend. I've had this from one of my previous lives. Every engine gets a diagnostic check after it's, if I'm trying to figure out, for example, troubleshooting this 409 that I just did, one of the first checks I do is a leak down test to check how well the engine is sealed. And then after the break-in of an engine, before I go to the dyno, typically I will take a leak down test to make sure I don't have any valves leaking, and we know how well the cylinder's sealing. This is a solid valve lifter. If you're going to degree a cam, you need to go by one solid valve lifter. If you use it, I use degree a cam by using the valve lifter on the cam and one push rod dial indicator onto the push rod. I've displayed that before. So you need to make sure that's a solid lifter, because if it's not, it could actually collapse on you a little bit in the process, and you might not get an accurate reading. So I use a solid lifter. Degreeing a cam, you need a degree wheel. Oh, this is another old friend. I bought this in 1969. It's a Mr. Gasket one. There are lots more elaborate ones now that you can buy, are 2 feet in diameter. They got 2 dials. One goes one way, one goes the other way. But I'm doing just fine with this, thank you. It's still got all 360 degrees in it. And I can guarantee that I can put a cam in plus or minus a half a degree with that. And that's more accuracy than you really need. If you ever dyno an engine, 3 or 4 degrees doesn't really make much difference. So plus or minus half a degree, minus a half a degree will get you by. And so I use this for every engine degreeing. And these are just hoses for if you need to put air in your cylinder, a chuck to put air in your cylinder. For example, if you're changing valve springs on the engine, you need to lock air in that cylinder to make sure your valve doesn't fall into the engine when you're doing that, to hold the valve up. So you can chuck air in, put your air chuck onto that. And this is for my leak down tester. So, okay, we're moving along. We're getting there. So dead blow hammer. To check the set when you install the crankshaft, you need to set the main bearings. So you need to give her a good hit on each end with the hammer. This is called a dead blow hammer, and that helps to set their main bearing before you take your main bearing clearance check. And that's one way. And the hammers come in handy for lots of things. So let's be honest, okay? A good straight edge. I actually have a longer one. It's not in view right now, but a good straight edge for a whole bunch of things. One of the things we use it for when you're installing an oil pump, to make sure the oil pump is the right depth in the engine between the bottom of the oil pump pickup and the pan. We use this tool for that. Changing valve springs on an engine is the tool I use. I lost the handle years ago. I don't know where it is, but this works just fine. So this threads right onto the rocker arm stud. It's 2-ended. One ends for 7/16 and one ends for 3/8. So small block, big block, 7/16 studs, whatever. You just turn it around and it does either one. And that's how I get valve springs on and off. And for example, when we start up, and I do this frequently, not every engine, depending. When we start up Tony's engine, we're going to start it up with a nice set of soft springs out of the 602 race motor. And after the cam is completely broken in, I'm going to change all the springs and put the right springs on it. So it gets used a lot. Things like dividers, okay, are handy for measuring. And you can take these measurements and transfer them to a dial caliper or whatever else if you have to measure things. Once again, not necessarily an essential tool for everybody, but something that I use. Simple thing like this, which has got all the thousandths of an inch in it if you're doing something like adjusting the valves or something like that on an engine. It's got the range. This one goes right up to 35 thou from, I think, 5 thousandths of an inch. It's a little bit beat up because it's probably been pounded on number of different ways. I have 3 or 4 of these actually. This is just the one I picked out. So it's just a standard gauge. So with that, commodity things like this is break-in assembly lube. You need a whole bunch of things. So you need bar sol, you need brake clean, you need WD-40, all those kind of things in order to do a job. If you're doing a camshaft, you need break-in lube for it. You need things like Permatex. These are commodity things. They aren't really tools, but for sealing and stuff. There's different colors of it. So blue is typically for water, where you're sealing water. The ultra gray or ultra black is usually for when you're trying to seal oil, and they're just actually a silicone. They probably all work, but that's how they advertise them anyways. So here's a unique tool that not many people have, and I haven't used it very often. I bought this. I had a cylinder head that had been installed, aluminum head, and the thread in the head got damaged. The head's on the engine, so you don't want to take it off, and you can't go in there and fix the thread because you're going to end up knocking the damaged parts into the engine. This actually comes out of here. I got to get it out of here. Maybe I'll show you the way it works. This actually goes into the head and it threads back out. So when it threads back out, it pulls threads, pulls whatever it picks up in the threading process out of the head instead of pushing it into the head. Not a very common tool. I've only had to use it once, but I have. So priming an engine, I've showed this before. So a priming tool, this is for a 409, and this is for a small block Chev or a big block Chev. They all work, 427 right down to 265. And so in the old days, we just used a big screwdriver handle or a big screwdriver blade, and it kind of worked. But why this works better, where the aluminum is, the tunnel where the oil gets fed to your rocker, your lifters and all that, if you don't block that with these aluminum devices, that oil just turns back and falls back into the oil pan. So you won't get as thorough a job. So basically this disc goes in, this tang drives your oil pump, your drill goes on this end, and you can make oil pressure. And that's why you need this little guy. You need an oil pressure gauge. If you're priming an engine, make sure you know you got oil pressure. You connect that to wherever your gauge goes and use it for that. So I got two of these guys for small blocks and big blocks. So I got safety glasses. You need safety glasses, and if you're going to do a lot of operations, you should be wearing safety glasses. Make sure you do that. So this is a frost plug install tool. A little bit of controversial. About 6 months ago, I made a video showing how you can install frost plugs using a big socket, and you can. I've installed hundreds of them that way. Somebody said you should buy the right tool. So I did, and now I do use this tool. It's a little bit easier on the frost plug, and what this ridge does is make sure you don't drive the plug in too far. This will stop at the block. You put the frost plug on there, hit it with the hammer, and home it goes, and the job is done. So now you don't need one of these. If you got a big socket, you can put a frost plug in without it. This guy, and I can't find the other part of it. There's a shaft that threads on here. This fits onto an oil pump pickup when you're driving an oil pump pickup into the oil pump. There's a little ridge on it, and it gives you a way. Some guys just use the open end of a wrench or whatever. It gives you a way to contact it properly. Kind of hard to demonstrate without the other part, but that's a handy tool. Razor blades. You need some razor blades. They're handier than you think. For cutting up gaskets, cleaning up stuff, a whole bunch of different things. It's a handy thing to have. So installing pistons, here's one way that I can do it. This is a pretty good one. This is a universal ring compressor. You put this around the piston and you tighten it up and you get it all nice and square. And it's got a taper on it, and the bottom is made so it won't fall into the cylinder. And you tap the piston home. And if I don't have the exact size, the luxurious way or the nice way to do it is to have the exact size. I've got, I think this is 4 of them. And my buddy Tom has a bunch too. Between the two of us, we've got quite a few engines covered. We borrow back and forth. This is a nice way to do it. You just drop the piston in there and make sure all the rings are contained in it, and you drive it home, and it's a lot faster than this guy. But this is if you're going to use a universal one, if you're going to do a lot of engines, these are not inexpensive, which means they are expensive. And if you're only going to do one engine of that size, you might just want to do it this way. It works okay. My endoscope camera for looking inside of engines. I've diagnosed stuff inside of engines with an endoscope camera. If you want to know what's going on, the 409, one of the first things we did was stick this into the combustion chamber, and we put it in the oil pan. We put it under the intake manifold, and we found out lots about that engine before we even started to take it apart. So a pretty handy tool. So we're getting there. We're almost done, guys. So this is a depth micrometer. So one of the ways of measuring, one thing you have to know if you want to know how much compression your engine is going to have, or if you're going to machine a block to 0 deckhead or whatever deck number, you need to measure where you're at before you start. So typically, small block shafts, most engines are somewhere around 30 thousandths deck height before you start. So this guy fits over the top of the block. You thread the micrometer down until it touches the piston, and that tells you how far down the hole the piston is. That's one way to do it. There are other ways. This is one way. And anything you want to measure depth, it's called a depth micrometer, and it's kind of a specialized tool. Doesn't get a lot of use, but when you need it, and that's pretty handy to have. So what do I got underneath here? A simple compression tester. So one of the things we do on every engine after we get it broken in, before we go to the dyno, do a compression check so we know. And when we design the engine, we try to predict what compression it's going to have. And so you want to validate that, and we document that. We know what that compression is, and if there's another event, the engine's involved in, we go back to that record and see what that compression was. And has something gone wrong? Is the compression been lost? Has it got more? Whatever. Interesting and valuable to know. This is a tool you don't need to buy, that's for sure. It's not inexpensive either. This is a tool for measuring the length of connecting rod bolts. And one of the precise ways of installing torquing connecting rod bolts. Connecting rod bolts are the most critical bolt in any engine. So you need to get it right. So typically on a small box Chevron, most engines, when you tighten the bolt, it stretches about 6 thousandths of an inch. So the way you would use this is you would measure it before you tighten it, and then you would tighten it until you get 6 thousandths of an inch stretch. So the other thing you can do, if you look up the torque recommendation and it says it's 50 foot-pounds, and the thread is oiled or lubricated whatever way it was specified, and you tighten it to 50 foot-pounds, guess what? You'll probably be pretty close to 6 thou. So it's a nice, precise tool. Certainly not everybody needs to own one of these. They are quite expensive. I do have it, and I use it in specialized situations. I don't always use it for a normal build because, once again, if you torque the spec, you do it right, you follow the process, you'll get the right result. So what you did see is my little easy bake oven here. So I only really have one main use for that, is if I'm installing timing gear on the front of a crankshaft, one of the ways you can do, it's a press fit, about 1 thousandths press fit. You drive that guy home. I don't like doing that. So I put it in my oven at 400 degrees for 10 or 15 minutes. I get out my welding glove, big heavy glove, and I slide it on with my fingers, and then you don't have to put any stress on your crankshaft or the gear as well. So it only gets used once per engine basically, but it's still handy when I need it. These guys, if you're installing connecting rods where the bolts stick out as opposed to using cap screws, put these on the bolts when you're sliding the piston into the board and make sure they're sharp. If they hit your crankshaft, they could put a scratch in it. So if you use these guys, it'll do things. It'll actually guide the piston or the connecting rod, and at the same time they'll protect it to make sure it doesn't get damaged. Ring expander. So we just talked about a ring compressor. This is a ring expander. You put the piston ring in there and it expands. Now some guys install piston rings with their fingers and don't use expanders, that's fine. I mean, I don't have an opinion on that. This is how I do it. If you set it up right and do it right, it makes installing a ring really fast, and you don't have to put any stress on the ring whatsoever in order to do that. These are really inexpensive, and that's the way I always do it. So, hones. So we got a couple here. One is a small brake hone. I usually use this for valve lifter bores, where the valve lifters go into the block against the camshaft, especially if an engine needs to be cleaned up or whatever, to make sure the valve lifters, spin nicely in the bore. And it's actually a brake cylinder hone is what it is, and they work pretty good and doesn't get used a lot. But when we need it, we need it. A lot of times my engines go to machine shop, they get honed on the Sun CK10 or whatever it is, nice machine. But if we do a budget build, we do it at home. And typically I have two sets of stones. One of them is 220 grit, and this is a 400 grit stone. So I'll put 220 grit in first and get on a rough surface, and then finish it off with a 400 grit. If I'm using a chrome moly type ring, you don't want a big coarse grit on your bore. Now, is that as good as machine shop job? No. But does it work okay? Yes. Does it give you a good compression, a good sealing of your piston rings, all that stuff? Yes. So the results are just fine. So I do that quite a bit. Torque wrenches, you need 3 sizes. You need the little baby one like this for 1/4 inch stuff. And you need, this is probably the most used one. This is up to 100 foot-pounds. And it's a DeWalt one. And for most bolts that get torqued on an engine, this is the most commonly used. Some engines need more than 100 foot-pounds of torque, so this one goes to 250 foot-pounds. So if I'm using like a big block Chev, or even the Pontiacs, I think are 95 to 105, for example. So I would use that tool. So power tools. So they're all battery powered. Once again, there's other ways of doing that. So you need a drill, and I showed that already for lots of things, but one of the most common things is priming your oil pump. That, of course, I showed that already. It just chucks in here like this, and then this drives your oil pump shaft, and you're good to go. So what I missed when I was back here, by the way, what I had in here was a bridge that also can be used for checking positive stop to make sure that your piston stops. And you got a hoist to pick up your engine. That's one thing. You need a way to connect it. So you can put chains and a whole bunch of other ways. This is the tidy way. You bolt this on to where the carburetor goes. And that's how typically we move engines around with a lift plate. I go through a lot of them because typically the engine goes out and the guy says, I'll bring the plate back, and I never see him again. So I bought a lot of these over time. If you're installing your own valve seals, this is a valve seal installer tool. So you get the valve seal set in place on the head and give that a little tap, and it'll put your valve seal in place. So I think I've covered most of the stuff. So power tools. This is a little nut driver. This isn't very powerful, 10 or 15 foot-pounds. Probably is all it does, just for saving time. I don't tighten anything with this. I just basically run nuts in and out with it. But it's a really handy tool. It gets used lots. You need a good light of some kind. And there's different ways of doing that. You don't need one of these mother thumpers, but they are pretty nice. For taking heads apart or something apart where it's big and you got lots of torque, they can sure speed up the work. And I do use it quite a bit. This was, I think, my Christmas present from my son a couple of years ago. So I found lots of use for it. There's the bridge. I got it right in my hand. There's the bridge that bolts onto the top of your block. It's adjustable. I think I've showed that already. So, okay, I think we're getting, so here's the other thing you need. If you're going to install your own camshaft bearings, this is a camshaft bearing install tool for a small block Chev. It's a wonderful tool. You never damage your camshaft bearing with it, and it's fast. but it's only good for small box Chevs. And if you're going to do a lot of small box Chevs like I do, it's a money well spent. I also have it. I don't have it in here. It's in the other shop. I also have a universal tool for every other engine. It's not a small box Chev. And they work too, but you got to adjust the universal tool. If you don't get it just right once in a while, you can damage a bearing. It does happen. So the other thing you need is knowledge. Probably the most important thing. And if I do any engine, if I haven't done it already, I already don't have it. Here's my 348 409 book. No matter how much you think you know, there's something you don't know, or there's something somebody else knows that could be helpful. So I buy the book and read it and make sure I know what I'm doing. And then I document, it's just a copy of that, but I buy a binder for every engine, and I keep everything filed in a binder. If you buy the camshaft's going to have the camshaft specs, the cylinder heads are going to have specs, all that kind of stuff. Pistons, all the documentation for that engine. So you can go back to that binder. Usually goes with the customer if he wants it. Usually they take it. And he has a record of everything that's inside that engine. So starts here. A manual is another great thing. I've showed this many times. This is one of my favorite books. Some of the pages have been opened many, many times. And when you're dealing with installing something, specific torquing or whatever, do not guess. Get the information. Get it right. Because if you don't get it right, well, you might do a lot of hard work and for nothing and do damage. Here's my Pontiac one for my Pontiacs. Okay, so I also keep my own binder of copies of all kinds of data that I can refer to on the run, torque specs and clearances and all that kind of stuff for a variety of engines. So I have a quick reference to go to if I have work in progress. That's all in addition to a basic set of tools. I didn't mention you need sockets, wrenches, open ends, close ends, box ends, screwdrivers, pliers. All that stuff's in here. I'm not going to get all that out. That's a basic set of tools you need. Now, once again, before I close off, you don't necessarily need all this stuff. I'm showing you what I have and what I do. I probably actually missed a few things. I'm looking around to see if I did, but most of the things I think I have covered. And you can decide for yourself and which tools you need, how you're going to acquire them, and whether you want to invest in them. Hope you found that interesting and helpful. Please give me some comments on it. Comments are also another way that YouTube knows somebody's interested in what I do. So we love the comments. As you probably know, if you follow my channel, I really try hard to answer all the comments. I might miss some once in a while, just the way things go. I get overwhelmed sometimes, but I've answered thousands of comments and I try to do that. And the other thing, knowledge, you can go to books. Where's the other one? Go to your computer, right? Google, or you can go to YouTube and check out Gold's Garage. There's another good source of information too. So, and there's probably a few other channels beside that. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching Gold's Garage.